morning and welcome back from our break. Up next, we have a presentation on inquest recommendations and the NAN education table reset. The presenter will be Julian Faulkner and Deputy Grand Chief Bobby Narcisse will join him. Just a note on this presentation, we'll be running probably an extra 10 to 15 minutes longer than planned than what's on the schedule. So our break will be pushed back to around 11:15 or so. We'll come back when that break is done, and we'll wrap up the second presentation on scheduled time for 12:15. So I'll hand this over to Deputy. Deputy?
Hello, hi there. Everybody hear me? Yeah, okay. Julian, you there?
I'm here, Deputy.
Chris? Like these Zoom calls are sometimes like a seance for the living, you know? Julian, are you there? Jocelyn, are you there? You know what I mean? Like it's all interesting world that we're in with this Zoom calls these days and everything. So it's great to have everyone back, and it's my pleasure to really welcome Julian Faulkner and his team to discuss and to give a presentation on inquest recommendations and the NAN reset table. I've been working with Julian for a number of years now. We worked together on a number of files, especially through our work at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal process, where we sought, in NAN, Anishinaabe Nation sought intervener status at that CHRT case that found the federal government guilty of discriminating against our First Nations children in the areas of child welfare and services. So we've made a lot of inroads with his legal team and our Chiefs Committee and our staff and all these different areas. You know, like he participated in the 7 Youth Inquest that happened earlier on. But also more recently, he's been working, him and his firm has been working with us to really establish, you know, a bilateral table between NAN and Canada with respect to child and family services and the reform that's happening there in our other files, and the footholds that we have at that particular table really paved the way and educated us as well. That's why we're always saying that we need to have decision makers at the table, and with our role within child and family services reform and NAN's bilateral table, especially with the position of remoteness, we need to take into consideration our remoteness issues and our remoteness challenges, and the fact that we brought that through the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal process gave birth to the RQ table, and we were able to establish those inroads and goals with the help of Julian Faulkner and his team as well. And as a result of that, the work that we did through the tribunal process gave birth to different community-based programming, such as Choose Life. You know, I mentioned, I got Choose Life here, yeah. So like we even have like the Choose Life program. You know, we have the band reps, we got like prevention dollars going straight to the First Nation communities. You know, we've advocated a pathway forward to really making laws for our First Nation communities with respect to child and family services. So, so Julian and I have been, and our team have been working very extensively in that area. And that's why when I got the this portfolio as well, we were able to review the work that's been happening, and the fact that, you know, like a lot of good work has been happening, but, you know, we need to be where the decision makers are. I think we also heard it from our panel presentation of people from across Canada that they were saying that, you know, there were negotiations that were happening back and forth, but at times it was like a time-consuming process, even years, in terms of, you know, getting the government's or the Crown's position or mandates on particular things, and how it spelled down to their negotiators. So we want to ensure that our work moving ahead also echoes work and what's been happening in other areas as well, to really strengthen and empower our education team, guided by our education partners as well across Anishinaabe Nation, to ensure that we are at tables, that we need to have a true nation-to-nation discussion, like having our rights and treaty holders there as well to give that pathway forward and direction. And this morning, we have, like I said, Julian Faulkner here, who's been very integral to the work that we're doing. And he is our legal counsel, but also he is becoming one of our negotiators as well within this realm moving ahead. And so I'd like to welcome him and his team. And he's going to be talking about the importance of the inquest recommendations and how it also leads to the NAN table. So Julian, you're there?
Good morning, Deputy. And it's
Good morning.
an honor
Good to have you here.
It's an honor to be here. I want to start by recognizing that the realities of pandemic have us in many different parts of this province, if not country. So I'm actually, while we have offices in the north this week, I'm addressing you from our office from the south. I'm in the lands of the Mississauga of the Credit. I didn't know this before, but I know it now. That I didn't know that the word Toronto is actually Mohawk for where trees are standing in the water. So I just want to acknowledge the territory that I speak to you from, while also, of course, acknowledging the territory of Anishinaabe Nation being Treaty 9 and Treaty 5 territory. It's an honor to speak to you this morning and to talk about a number of issues that I prefer to use the words leveraging for success. How do we, and this is very much about Deputy Grand Chief Narcisse's vision, how do we take past successes and leverage them on the path forward as it relates to education? And that's very much what the vision of the Deputy Grand Chief around the education reset table is about. How do we take what has been gained in the area of, example, child welfare, but also in the area of policing and other matters where NAN is actually leading the way for the country? How do we take those gains and use them to strengthen other areas, including education? And it's not because education hasn't already got important achievements. It's not because of a suggestion of failure. It's always about what I heard Grand Chief Fox speak about in some of his speeches, about not working in silos, learning from each other's successes, and then using those successes to leverage further successes. So it's in that context that I wanted to speak about the 7 Youth Inquest, what was achieved and the work to be done in the context of education reform, and then take on the broader issue of Indigenous law and how we see Indigenous law and its recognition. And I want to say recognition because I'm extremely aware and respect the words we heard both from elders and other prominent community members yesterday, that you don't need anyone to recognize or confirm the existence of Indigenous law. It simply exists. I think of Mike McKay's words yesterday. We've been on this land for over 10,000 years. We must have been doing something right. And we don't need outsiders to tell us what is right and good for us, what we can't and can't do. And Matthew Angies, when he referred to education isn't simply about a treaty right, it's a birthright. And all of these feed into, in my mind, the teachings I'm receiving from these words, these very wise words, is you don't need, and I'm an outsider, I'm a settler, I'm an odd duck, Jamaican Polish, makes me not exactly white. You could call me the only Jamaican Polish stud you'll ever meet, I think, Deputy. But the bottom line from it all is you don't need me to tell you what your law is. And so I don't offer the words or the presentation in that vein. What I'm doing is making observations and raising ideas for your respectful consideration, many of which you could reject. And that's the nature of advice. I wear two hats. I wear the hat of a lawyer, so that's legal, fair. But I also have found, and it is proven to be correct, that the reality is that I also serve with political leadership as a negotiator. And so I end up wearing those two hats and offering insights as we go. And so I want to start with this observation that when we are talking about negotiations, it's one of the trickiest issues that I think is out there. I talk about negotiations kind of being like, house sales, selling houses. Everyone is convinced, why would I pay this bloody commission? I could sell my own house. I could sell this property in an urban setting like Thunder Bay or something myself. I don't need somebody to do it for me. We all assume that we can do these things, and negotiations is a lot like that. It's not necessarily recognized as a professional expertise. We use negotiations to accomplish certain things, and we try to do it in the context of NAN by keeping in mind certain things that need to be, I say, are essentials for a successful negotiation. This is going to take me into the 7 Youth Inquest, but I just want to make this observation from the beginning. There are 4 elements in my mind, in my, to be honest, now 30 years as a lawyer that I've observed. There's 4 items that you want to be very careful are present when to set a negotiation up for success. So negotiation first is about the players. So who's at the table? And I don't just mean the other side, I mean our side too, right? Who's at the table? That's the players. The second is strategy. What is your strategy? The third is leverage. What leverage do you have available? And the fourth is timing. These are interrelated, but the 4 of these items, if they're present and they're used properly, can create immense gains where before things weren't moving. And so I'm going to now go into the discussions around the 7 Youth Inquest, but talk about negotiation context at the same time, because I really want to talk about the history of the 7 Youth Inquest, because respectfully, and I had the honor, and if you could put up the letter just for a minute, please. Chris Rapson, my colleague, a lawyer with our firm, is helping me on this matter, and I'm very grateful to him, along with Justin Gordon Deacon, a paralegal from our firm. But in March 2008, so some 14 years ago, and if you go to the first line of the letter, it reflects that at the time we were acting for NAN in respect of the deaths in the communities at that time. All right. And you should know that, and it's reflected in the letter, but you should know that at that time there had been 5 deaths in the communities. So now we're going 14 years ago, right? And I'm only doing this to start the discussion about the 7 Youth Inquest. To know where you're going, you need to know where you came from, right? We learn that from elders, and we need to learn that also by way of institutional memory, I respectfully suggest. So David Eden was the regional coroner at the time for Thunder Bay, and we wrote, and you can go to the second page, about the 5 deaths that had occurred by March 2008. And I want to emphasize after March 2008, and you can see we are talking about the deaths of Jethro Anderson, Curran Strong, Paul Panachis, Robin Harper, and Reggie Bushy. And these are people, these are terrible tragedies, and we could spend hours, and that wouldn't do it, on each person talking about their significance to their families and their communities. So I don't want to roll over this like it's just a presentation. These are lives lost, and my condolences continue to go out to the families. Since March 2008, since the writing of that letter, the communities and families then lost Kyle Morriso and Jordan Wabas. And so those were the 7 youth. Now, we wrote in March 2008 asking the coroner's office to intervene, and you can bring the letter down. Thank you, Chris. We wrote and we wanted action by the coroner's office. We wanted a reflection of the fact that the death investigation services and inquiry services that exist for non-Indigenous people needed to be available for Indigenous people. And a negotiation started where the coroner's office said, okay, we're going to do an inquest into the death of Reggie Bushy. We'll look at the factors that affected all 5 deaths, but we're just going to look at the inquest into the death of Reggie Bushy. I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining how we got to an inquest into 7 youth. I'm just going to tell you, this is exactly an example of where negotiation became everything and leverage became everything. That was not good enough for the deputy grand chief at the time who had the portfolio, a little known name by the name of Alvin Fiddler. He was deputy grand chief who had the portfolio in respect of justice issues. The idea that only one death would be looked at against the context of the 5 wasn't good enough. And when things started to come out in and around the same time about the fact that First Nations people weren't on juries and that the jury system in the North was in effect invalid, Deputy Grand Chief used that reality to negotiate with Ontario, to force their hand, and to create an inquest about all 7 deaths. Remember, I talked about one of the essentials of negotiations being strategy, another being leverage. We use the leverage in relation to the issues being played out in open courts around the invalid juries to our advantage and to make a deal. I had the honor of negotiating the actual convening of an inquest into all 7 deaths, and I had the honor of negotiating the convening of the Yakabuchi inquiry, all based on the leverage that I've just described. This is just an example, and I'm using this because one success can lead to another. And when we're talking about Deputy Grand Chief Narcisse's vision for education reset, that's where I'm going. I want to talk in terms of concrete results and strategies. So let's talk about the inquest, and let's start by people appreciating what a verdict sheet looks like. So you can put that up, please, Chris. And I'm just doing this because, you know, these are real lives, but these inquests are convened so that the jury is capable of hearing the circumstances of the loss and then rendering what they call a verdict. And I'm just using an example verdict sheet for you to see. We're going to scroll through it quickly. The jury actually makes a finding, right? That is, you'll see it as to who the deceased was, the date of their death. And I don't mean to say these things lightly. I mean, obviously, these are tragedies. The cause of death, okay, in this case, and in that case, they put accident. And we can talk about some of these determinations by the jury on the by what means. Some of them are undetermined. In my view, some of them could have and should have been homicide. But the bottom line is, and I want to make it clear, I want you to see that these are the functions of the jury to return this kind of verdict sheet. In addition to the verdict sheet, and you're going to just show the recommendations if you're able to pull those up, the jury is entitled to make recommendations on how to prevent similar deaths in the future. And you see that they made and rendered verdicts in relation to each of the deaths. And then I'm going to stop and show you something that's very unusual for a jury verdict in an inquest. There's a table of contents. This was an extremely long process. The jury case, the inquest took over between 1 year and 2 years. And NAN, in addition to negotiating the inquest, Anishinaabe Nation got public interest standing, and my firm had the honor of representing NAN at the inquest. Now, you'll see all the different sections of the verdict sheet of recommendations. So now we're getting into the meat of what and why I'm talking to you about this stuff. Look at the areas for reform that have been the subject of jury recommendations. And I can't emphasize enough that, and if you could, please go back to the original, or just go back to the verdict sheet that's easily accessible, Chris. Stopping there, you'll see the verdict was issued on June 16th, sorry, June 28th, 2016. So this verdict and these recommendations are 6 years old. 6 years old. Now go to the table of contents. We're going to, in this discussion, talk about what hasn't been done for 6 years and why I respectfully suggest, and it's not through lack of trying, okay? NAN has important resources dedicated to trying to follow through with the inquest recommendations. And some, of course, have been followed through. But the fundamental important long-term reform has not. And conversations with Sherry and Kathy from the education department make clear that there are serious roadblocks to making progress. But I wanted people to see the categories that the 145 recommendations that come from the inquest covered, all right? And the way these recommendations are set up, and you'll see this by scrolling down, that the each set of recommendations, right, are directed to specific parties. So in this case, there is a recommendation to Ontario on translation, right? And then you'll see the recommendations about working with the families to Canada and Ontario. And you see recommendations to Canada, Ontario, and NAN. And I want people to see this because people speak of the 7 youth inquests. It's kind of like talking, respectfully, it's kind of like talking about treaty. I'm not sure how many people have read this stuff, and I want to take the time to make sure we're all on the same page, all right? So now we're going to switch to the PowerPoint slide presentation, away from the specific verdict or a letter to you know, sort of the message we want to hopefully, in furtherance of Deputy's vision, bring home. And part of Deputy's vision about this education reset, there is very much a several tiered process. In other words, there are multiple goals here. One of those goals fundamentally is, of course, furthering and strengthening jurisdiction negotiations, so that, for example, the situation right now, like right as we speak, based on our analysis of the education jurisdiction table, and nobody would dispute this, and you know, Derek Chum at the education jurisdiction table, along with his support teams, are the ones telling us this. The people at the table are not decision makers. So something as important as education jurisdiction is actually being negotiated from Canada by people who are, frankly, what you'd call functionaries. They're low-level bureaucrats who don't have decision-making power. So part of the job is to, in education reset, to fix that. And the whole issue of education jurisdiction is massive, so it deserves decision makers. The other piece, away from jurisdiction for a moment, is about, okay, what are the things that we can do while jurisdiction is being negotiated by decision makers? What are the things that we can do in the short to medium term, such as building schools? It's talked about, it's identified as an imperative, but it still hasn't happened with any significant degree of frequency or effectiveness since 2016 and the inquest recommendations. In other words, I'm not saying there's no schools in communities. I'm saying what was identified as a need, which is schools for secondary youth. What's identified as a need is more schools and capital supports for teachers. They're not happening. And why? Deputy Grand Chief sees it as a question of red tape. There's too much red tape, and we need to look at cutting the red tape. Next page, please. We see the 7 Youth Inquest as potentially creating a direction and a roadmap to cut this red tape. So, for example, But we have to take a close look at why over 6 years have we not got there yet. So we're going to look at the different processes that are in place right now around the 7 Youth Inquest and ask some serious analytical questions about, are they working? So you should know that with the recommendations, Aboriginal Legal Services, often called ALS, a team of lawyers and legal supports who acted for family members at the inquest, took on the role of having a report card for the parties. We've identified recommendation implementation issues, thanks to help from Sherry and from Kathy at NAN, but also in consultation with Aboriginal Legal Services. In other words, what I'm speaking to you right now is based on our chats with those at ALS. Deputies said, okay, let's look at our lessons learned from Choose Life, from the RQ table, from the arrival of an agreement in principle. Let's look at what we've gotten there. How do we translate those child welfare wins into education success? Next slide, please. And so we've tried to, you can keep going, thanks. We've tried to be careful, to be respectful about the important work that has gone on in education. But I want to emphasize, because this is actually quoting Minister Bennett, the Government of Canada remains committed to the Chief Coroner's recommendations and to our continued work alongside First Nations partners to ensure a proper support system for students who attend schools off reserve away from their communities and families. And you see that dates back now, right? Of course, that dates back to 5 years ago. You see Grand Chief, you see the National Chief, and you see Carolyn Bennett. What is extraordinary to me is in 2022, these recommendations, for the most part, the big ones, are still unimplemented and not done. Now, sorry, I'm just going to make sure my version of the PowerPoint catches up with where we're at. I'm going to drive poor Chris crazy. So what we have identified, first and foremost, is that we have a flawed process for implementation. All right. And it's not a flawed process because Aboriginal Legal Services is incompetent. It's a flawed process because the implementation process isn't resourced at all. That is, Aboriginal Legal Services is not funded to do these report cards. They apply some resources at it. It's not enough, and it respectfully does not actually produce a product that speaks directly to what is done and not done. And I'll explain that in a minute. So there's a flawed implementation process. And I want to be straight about that, because I don't think we want to spend our time doing the same thing over and over again when there's real fundamental flaws. Specifically, the report card indicates that recommendations have been implemented when they have not actually been implemented. And it's not because they're trying to mislead, but let me give you an example. In respect of Canada, right? It's recommendation 26, next page, please. You see where it says complete? Number 26, number 52, complete. Provide funding to construct, enlarge, refurbish in respect of accommodations for teachers. You see how it's marked complete. Revise INAC policies to cover costs relating to building operations, maintenance of schools, and student accommodations. You see how that says complete, right? Well, what you will want to know, right? And please take us to the page. This would be at page 9. What you will want to know for these various recommendations, that ALS assigns a grade of complete where progress by only one party to a recommendation has been made. That is, complete will be entered if only one party, we've got an email piece that's popped up on screen. Oh, maybe on my side. Nope. Chris, do you have, is it showing?
I don't
Sorry.
see it, Julian.
Okay, we're good then. And what's happening is the usage of the term complete means if there's multiple parties who were the target of a recommendation, if only one of the parties have completed their portion of it, they mark the recommendation complete. So obviously that gets extremely problematic when something is directed to Ontario and Canada and only one of the parties have done something, or when something is directed to NAN, Ontario and Canada, and again, only one of the parties have done it. They use the term complete to suggest those are done. As we said, right, Aboriginal Legal Services represented the families at the inquest and still represents families. And so I'm not taking away from their efforts. It's just that they received no funding for this exercise, and the analysis done by summer students is highly problematic. And this is based on information that Aboriginal Legal Services has helped us with. So this isn't about, you know, sort of criticizing them. It's about my raising issues with the process that's going on right now. There's this expression in progress. It covers the vast majority of these recommendations. They're in progress. I mean, we're going to be in progress forever. And this is what characterizes, you know, efforts at Indigenous reform. It's to Canada's advantage to be in progress forever, right? Canada has asked ALS to stop producing the report publicly. So I take that as a sign that it is having a salutary effect. But the bottom line is, as an example, and you know, there are some who will want to send their youth outside of their community to go to school. I'm not trying to presume where a family may wish their youth to get education, but for those families that have expressed a preference that their youth are not in Thunder Bay, exposed to the vulnerabilities that are there, and they want their kids to be educated at home, no schools have been built or refurbished in NAN territory that we can tell since the issuance of the recommendations. All right. And we're very concerned that the movement on these recommendations is very poor. NAN has supports in place to try to advance the recommendations, but truth be known, when we hear from NAN department that the key recommendations around fundamentally changing funding, fundamentally changing how to convert from a proposal-based yearly short-term unsustainable system to a long-term system, that gains have not been made at all. And so when you look at what we call implementation issues, you can find out why. Political table meets once a year and doesn't include decision makers. So there's a political table for the 7 youth recommendations, but there's no decision makers at the table. Remember what I talked about, an essential piece, right, to negotiations? Remember, I referred to parties, right? I referred to a strategy. I referred to leverage, and I referred to timing. So right away, you see how it fails under parties when decision makers aren't there. The task teams that were meeting quarterly since COVID have only met once or twice. We've pointed out that completed isn't completed. Their funding system, which has so many hurdles and is all around short-term create proposals to get funding, has created so many hurdles that NAN has had to return money because it is so problematic in terms of how non-user friendly the exercise is. Policy and funding changes are what could create long-term reform. They're not happening at the political table. So schools aren't being built and they're not being refurbished. And quarters for teachers aren't being built and teachers aren't being hired. And you know, these are the fundamentals you would measure success in education. I want to talk about what I said before. Are there lessons to be learned from the child welfare piece? And this is what Deputy Grand Chief Narcisse spoke about before. We can't work in silos. We have to take gains from one place and leverage them to another. And I want to talk in concrete terms because there's no point to some philosophical, theoretical discussion. First of all, I'm an ADD guy. I don't have the patience for it. So if we're not making concrete progress, let's move on to the next thing, right? So examples of concrete progress I'm going to respectfully offer is the Choose Life gains. We are between $300 and $400 million invested since the Choose Life agreement. And now it's been leveraged further into the AIP. The RQ table has resulted in a complete shift in the paradigm in terms of how agencies are funded in NAN territory and how communities are receiving funding. This has resulted in the agreement in principle that NAN leadership negotiated around remoteness indexing for the whole country. Next slide, thanks. So what are these lessons learned and what's to talk about? Well, first of all, from Choose Life, I just want to spend a few minutes because, again, these lessons get learned when there's institutional memory. When you're able to link, how did we do this before to what are we going to do now? To what are we going to do in the future? That's like, again, there has to be concrete reflections on this so that we can literally make the connections we need to make to set up future success. So I want to talk about this for a little bit in terms of Choose Life. I don't want to just use words and then move on, right? So I want to talk about what happened with the creation of Choose Life. I had the honor of representing NAN in relation to the tribunal proceedings. And it's in that context, the then director of social services is a little known name, Bobby Narcisse. In addition to being a genius Elvis impersonator, he of course worked tirelessly to head up that department. And it's only right and proper that he would be executing that portfolio as Deputy Grand Chief. So what a wonderful advantage for NAN on Child Family Services to have that very neat bridge between department and then political. Choose Life and the history of Choose Life is of course mired in tragedy. So much of the change that we talk about happens from tragedy, and I just want to reflect on that. It is the dynamic in NAN territory. It's the dynamic in the life of Indigenous people, and I want to recognize that unfortunately it's the truth that it takes tragedy before we see change, and then sometimes you don't see change anyway. But if we wanted to tell the truth in this case, the deaths of Jolene Winter and Chantal Fox, two 12-year-old girls at Wapakika, and the response. Wapakika had actually submitted an application for funding that was ignored. Canada said the funding application came at an awkward time in the funding cycle. Now, yes, it got approved after everything went national, but NAN leadership took the position that this could never happen again. Next slide, please. NAN leadership went national, and I can't emphasize enough focusing public attention on the deaths in Wapakika and the failure of Canada to literally provide support to a community who had organized themselves to provide support by way of land-based activities to their youth, a community that was organized enough to fill out an application and identify how a community-led mental health team could help their youth. It had worked before, it was going to work again. All of that was ignored. And so two 12-year-olds die. So NAN and the leadership of Wapakika, leadership of Mushkegowuk, the national leadership go public. And I had the honor of being legal counsel at the time, and I was present for that particular press conference. And how did we negotiate the funding around Choose Life? Well, I want to emphasize that funding and those negotiations happened as a result of a tribunal motion. And I just want to emphasize that this didn't just come from negotiation. And I can't emphasize enough that what ultimately happened, and you'll see this at slide 12, what you see is that there was a CHRT motion that led to NAN in Canada negotiating. This is 12, please. Oh, I'm sorry, it's 8. It's slide 8. I've slide 8. Thank you. It led to the tribunal proceeding that NAN brought. NAN in Canada brought them, or Canada responded. NAN brought a motion in front of the tribunal and asked for an order, that never again would an application be ignored, that there would be certain legal duties on Canada if presented with an application in the nature of Wapakika's application. Now, we brought the motion and we argued it, but we stopped after our argument, and Canada and NAN arrived at an agreement, a deal. And you can go back now to page 9. It's strange. Unfortunately, I seem to have something different on my slides in terms of page numbers. So I'm going to let you work with me there. Go to the next page, please. So there's lessons from Choose Life. Lesson 1 is the uptake and the success of the program in NAN communities. The Deputy Grand Chief has referred to this. Others speak of the success of Choose Life and its sustainability. But we didn't stop with the original process. It's now been institutionalized and negotiated by way of long-term funding into the agreement in principle that is now the new global resolution of child welfare matters. And so negotiations around a Choose Life table and the creation of long-term sustainable funding is part of the agreement in principle and will be part of the final settlement agreement. This is crucial because it identifies to you how we are leveraging what was accomplished before into long-term. The agreement in principle, next slide, please. The agreement in principle specifically provides for remoteness-based funding based on the remoteness quotient adjustment factor. And so now for the country, there is discussion around using a remoteness index to inform funding. There is now an assembly called the National Assembly of Remote Communities, for which Deputy Grand Chief Narcisse is a co-chair. It represents now a way to, on a national level, have remoteness voices heard. A remoteness secretariat is being created that will support First Nations with the collection of data, the collection of best practices when it comes to challenges in remote communities. And I want you to see one of the paragraphs, next slide, please, that exists in the NARC, we call it NARC, National Assembly of Remote Communities mission statement. While it is acknowledged that NARC has been established in the context of the global resolution discussions around the settlement of outstanding claims against Canada in the context of child welfare, NARC is intended to represent an advocacy voice across sectors, including but not limited to health, education, and community safety. Now you're seeing the bridging and you're seeing the leveraging, right? The agreement in principle has a provision for the creation of a remoteness secretariat, which shall be established by Canada and NAN, which shall have the primary responsibility for remoteness issues, support data collection and analysis efforts. And you will see, next slide, thanks, that the dedicated remoteness secretariat will be responsible for a whole host of operational supports and data collection to disseminate research and tools to assist First Nations leadership. So what are we doing? We're parlaying the RQ work in the first place into something bigger. Now we say there is no, and next slide, please. And the highlights from the RQ work make it clear that, you know, we started with one level, but we've leveraged it into something much bigger. And now What can we do on education, right? Next slide, please. And this is where I can't emphasize enough Deputy Grand Chief's position, that these current successes need to be plugged into the education reset table for NAN leadership and the NAN education department. Deputy Grand Chief is meeting with the minister. There has been a commitment to the creation of this reset table. I can tell you, having attended to provide legal support and negotiation support to the Deputy Grand Chief, that Minister Haidu expressly recognized, as did her support folks, the applicability of the NARC perspective, right, to the work, and expressly recognized the realities that remoteness adjustments need to be made in education, not because there's a commitment to do X or Y, but recognizing the overall principle. Next slide. And so what are we talking about here? We're talking about conducting a negotiation with finalized terms of reference, and that's being worked on with government as we speak. And the whole point is to have this reset table provide that table of decision makers that can oversee the technical work. So the good technical work that's going on as we speak, that needs to go on. It's essential. But what a boon to that work to have Deputy Grand Chief's vision go forward, to have a table of decision makers ready, willing, and able to receive the work and make decisions on the spot with NAN sitting there, right? Brand new. Ultimately, that would lead to a conclusion of the education jurisdiction agreement, a conclusion of education jurisdiction funding agreement, and the building of schools. It was made clear in the meeting by Deputy Grand Chief to Minister Haidu how important the 7 youth recommendations are. And we need actual movement to deal with the red tape. All of that is on the table. Now, Canada hasn't been given an opportunity to make the commitments yet, so we are speaking about NAN's position. But I want to emphasize that the outlook is optimistic. And this vision that the deputy has for NAN-specific processes that will create change are built on successes elsewhere. So thank you for listening to me. I'm sorry I talked so long, but Jocelyn will tell you immediately that that's just going to take away from your time on your other presentations. So I do want to give a chance to some questions, Jocelyn, and I'm happy to adjust my timing. I promise I won't be messing us up.
Thank you, Julian. Are there any questions for Mr. Falconer?
Julian is fine. Oh my God.
Mr. Julian, how's that?
Mr. Julian, that's pretty cool.
Mr. Julian, yeah.
Mr. Julian. I don't know if Deputy, you had some comments you wanted to make, or
no, thank you for that, Julian, for that, for your presentation and looking at the applicability of a lot of the work that we've been doing, and we made inroads and moving ahead. Just a side note too, I know you mentioned the NARC, and I know we were going to call it the National Assembly Remote Communities Implementing Social Services Exchange Equity. So it'd be Narcisse actually instead of NARC, but we voted on NARC and stuff. But that's a testament to the work that Anishinaabe Nation and its staff and its leadership is doing. Like we're turning heads as well and stuff. Like when we did the presentation on RQ, like Northwest Territories called us, and Northern Saskatchewan, MKO and FSIN, and MKO in Manitoba and FSIN in Saskatchewan. We're saying, yeah, our remote communities are going through the same thing, and we're always forced to, argue over a fixed pot at a provincial system that we're always currently engaged in. And they were saying that, yeah, like this, we want to join you. We want to, echo your voice or bring strength to the remote community's voice, because like we have to respect the fact that we have regional differences as well, especially, within Ontario and other First Nations as well. But, that it's a testament to the work that needs to happen. And yeah, so and the work continues, and we can't do this without, you know, our partners as well here at the community level. We heard yesterday too, like we need to also, I know we're going full speed ahead on this, but also we have to also take the time and consideration to ensure that you know, our community members know what we're doing, our community partners and our education partners as well, to know what this reset table is, and how you know, our work, our bilateral table with Minister Haiju is going to be working, how it affects them as well. But I know that we're setting the stage, you know, like we don't know all the answers yet, but still we want to ensure that there is that opportunity for that leadership, for our leadership to, and our negotiating team to have those decision makers at the table. So many of our communities are still waiting, or going through the red tape, and as Julian mentioned, but you know, those are things we want to change, and we can't do that without your help as well. So I'll turn over back to Jocelyn and Julian.
There's one question from the group this morning. We're wondering if the presentation and or report that this presentation is created for will be provided, will be shared.
Yeah, so I've just asked my team, and I want to emphasize that the great organizing administration for this summit is very effective, and I drove them crazy because I didn't get materials to them in advance like I was supposed to, because I'm just a nightmare to deal with. So I've asked Chris to actually put the link on the chat line so that you could get materials directly. So hopefully that has worked, and if it doesn't work, we'll get it to you through the organizers, but we should be able to just put it directly on the chat line, I think. So Chris, will you work with folks and make that PowerPoint available ASAP? And Chris says it's coming shortly, so that's perfect. It'll be on the chat line.
Great, thank you. I think we'll wrap this session up. We're gonna take a 15-minute break, so we'll come back at 11:40 a.m. And the code word for this session is sovereign. The play to win code is sovereign. So please write that down and enter during the break, and we will see you at 11:40 in 15 minutes.